I want to say a word about Hebrew University. I never attended it, but it played a formative, and I have to say in some ways a tragic part in my education as a commentator and my education as a Jew. In July of 2002, I had just assumed the editorship of the Jerusalem Post, and I was invited to speak to a group of American students who were spending their summer in Israel at the Hebrew University. And so I went and I chatted with these students for an hour and a half, went home, and I think about 10 days later, a date that's unforgettable for me, the 31st of July of 2002, 9 students were murdered in the Frank Sinatra cafeteria of the Hebrew University. And I've been thinking a great deal about that year, the year I became the editor. It was the height of what came to be known as the Second Intifada, a period of time in which approximately 1,000 Israelis were murdered in suicide bombings and other sorts of terrorist attacks. You have to keep that number in proportion. Israel's population is about 1/45 America's population. So 1,000 Israeli deaths proportionally is equivalent of 45,000 American deaths. Imagine a country visited with 15 9/11s in the space of 3 years. And that's the situation that Israel confronted back then. It was a particularly bleak and depressing moment to be in the country. Now, since I left the Post at the end of 2004, I just counted, I have visited Israel, usually for journalistic reasons, on 36 separate occasions. And this last time I was in Israel, I was there to interview Gadi Eisenkot, the outgoing chief of staff of the Israeli army. I also paid a visit to Israel's border fence with Lebanon. This is one of the most dangerous borders in the world, and you'll be interested to know that Israel manages to defend it by means of a simple fence, not a big, beautiful wall. I don't know how they do it. But perhaps the most striking moment for me during my entire visit was finding myself in the gym of my hotel in Jaffa and looking around and just happening to notice that the other 5 or 6 people using the gym that morning, all of them were Chinese. It tells you something about the transformation of the country into a destination for investment and a magnet for people seeking human and intellectual capital. And the broader transformation in Israel is something that we ought to take note of, that we ought to celebrate. Israel, for all that you see in terms of TV, the rockets from Gaza, the threat from Hezbollah, Israel is more secure than it has ever been. Israel is more powerful than it has ever been. When I interviewed General Eisenkot, he told me that Israel had conducted not scores, not hundreds, but thousands of strikes against Iranian targets in Syria. The first country to ever inflict a meaningful defeat and humiliation on Qasem Soleimani and the leaders of the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, is the Israeli Air Force, and they're doing it continually. When I was in Israel, the country was as isolated diplomatically as it has ever been. And yet in the last year, you've seen an Israeli prime minister openly visit the Emir of Oman, Israeli officials operating throughout the Middle East, including Bahrain, all the rest of the Gulf states, new diplomatic openings in Africa, unthinkable, what were once unthinkable openings in India and East Asia. it's a remarkable transformation in terms of what has come over the country. Now, you can think about why this changed in a number of ways, and obviously having better policies, whether it's on economics or security, any other issue, has something to do with it. But I think the more important changes are, in a sense, psychological and perhaps moral. Israel is not a better country today necessarily because there aren't undercurrents of bigotry and racism in Israeli society. But what is worth noting is that when there was an election just a few weeks ago, the Kaknik party that had that had formed an alliance with a right-wing party didn't even make the threshold, didn't even get into the Knesset. That's a sign of moral health in the society. Israeli politicians are no more or less corrupt than they were 15, 16 years ago when I lived there. But the sign of a health of a society is that you have an Israeli prime minister who is facing an indictment because you have an attorney general who's prepared to act independently in defense of what he believes the law should prescribe. A sign of a healthy society isn't that there isn't a continuing challenge when it comes to what to do with respect to the Palestinians. But a healthy society is one that is united in insisting that it is going to defend Israeli lives, Israeli sovereignty, Israeli rights against terrorist attacks coming from over the border. Those are signs of vigorous health in the society, and that we ought to take note of them. So for years, I used to go to Israel, come back and speak at luncheons or dinners like this, and try to explain all the ways in which Israel is facing a crisis. The truth about today is that it's Israel that's thriving, and we ought to take note of that, and we ought to celebrate it, and we ought to think of just what it was that Israel was able to do to move from those years of fear and terror to where the country stands today. Now, while I think that Israel is thriving, where I worry is with what we used to call the free world, with what we used to call the West. I spend a lot of my time in Europe. And thinking about the free world, if I can use the simile, I feel like we, and I speak in particular of the Jewish community, we ought to fear if we're not something like the lobster in the proverbial pot. You now have in Germany, the third largest party in the Bundestag is a quasi-fascist party that wants to practically write the Holocaust out of German history. That ought to worry us a great deal. You have in France the second largest vote getter in the last election, being the daughter of an avowed Holocaust denier and revisionist, Marine Le Pen. And you have in Great Britain the leader of Her Majesty's opposition being an out-and-out repeat offender when it comes to anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism that is, in his case, indistinguishable from anti-Semitism. That's scary, and that's Europe. Let's talk about the United States for 1 second. I do not think we can rest easy about the fact that 11 Jews were murdered at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Squirrel Hill in Pittsburgh because someone went in there convinced that those Jews were intending to ease the rights of immigrants. Jewish America, in its way, is the story of immigration par excellence. All of us, in my case, the child of a displaced person and a refugee, in all of your cases, or almost all of your cases, surely the child or the grandchild or the great-grandchild of refugees or immigrants, all of us have to be aware of the intrinsic connection between hatred of immigrants and a climate of hatred of immigrants and a climate of hatred against Jews. There are people here who are serving tables. When they're serving you, keep in mind the thought that they are your grandparents. Those were the positions our grandparents once filled, and here you are in this superb setting, this beautiful room. That's something that should scare us, not because it affects us now, but because at some point it will affect us. And we should also be alarmed, and in fact terrified, that a member of Congress can repeatedly make blatantly anti-Semitic comments about the reason and the rationale of Israel's abiding popularity in the American public and get away with it, and find herself not diminished, but emboldened. That is a moment of cultural accountability. It might be an inflection point. We should be aware of this fact. So it's not Israel that we should be worried about. It's what's happening in our communities in the West and in the United States. So that's what's changed. Some things, of course, have remained unchanging. Two issues in particular that are in the news that I think are worth mentioning. One, of course, as all of you are aware, the United States finds itself in a posture, once again, of confrontation with Iran. What should we do? How should we think about it? Well, the first way to think about it is not to say that we might go to war with Iran, although I certainly hope we won't. But it is to take cognizance of the fact that Iran has been at war with us for almost 40 years, since the moment they took our hostages in the fall of 1979, continuing to today. So that's the nature of that conflict. And it was true with the hostage taking. It was true with what Iran did through proxies to kill our Marines in Beirut and our diplomats in Beirut. It's true of Iran's role in the bombing of the Khobar Towers. It remains the case today. Now, how should we think about dealing with Iran? We should not be applying pressure on Iran for the sake of tripping into a hot war. We should be applying pressure on Iran for getting the best possible terms out of a renegotiation of a nuclear deal that should go as far as possible. The deal should be simple. We should offer the Islamic Republic, we should offer the leaders of Tehran the following: full normalization in exchange for full normalization. What does full normalization mean from us? It means an end to all of the economic sanctions. It means an end to restrictions on Iranian diplomats here in New York who can't travel beyond 25 miles of Turtle Bay. It should mean an American embassy in Tehran and an Iranian embassy in Washington. But in exchange for that kind of full normalization, in exchange for the relief from the economic pressure to which we've subjected Iran now, we should also expect full normalization. It is not normal that Iran should seek access to a full nuclear fuel cycle and at some point unlimited levels of enrichment in 10 or 15 years' time. That's not normal. South Korea doesn't ask for it. Other countries don't ask for it. It's not normal that Iranian proxies and Iranian troops are murdering people as we speak in Syria, are arming Hamas in Gaza, are furnishing ballistic missiles to Hezbollah in Lebanon and to the Houthis in Yemen. That's not normal either. The way Iran treats its own people, and particularly its vulnerable minorities, is not normal. And it is especially not normal the way Iran has treated its women for the past 40 years. I have great respect for the Me Too movement. There is no more honorable or courageous Me Too movement in the world today than that movement of Iranian women who are removing their chadors in the squares and the streets of Tehran and Isfahan and elsewhere in the country and waving them, fully aware of the consequences that await them, because they just want a same shot and the same rights and freedoms that women in the Western world have and deserve. That should be the nature of full normalization. Now, the other great issue that's before us now in the Middle East is the question of peace between Israel and the Palestinians. And I have limitless faith in our negotiators, particularly Jared, to engineer something on a Kissingerian level of brilliance. You did see today in the news, hopefully in the New York Times, that the administration, the Trump administration, has proposed beginning a peace process between Israel and the Palestinians, or between the world and the Palestinians, with what it calls an economic peace. I'm a great critic of the administration, but this is exactly the right move. Palestinians deserve access to a normal economy. They deserve economic succor, not from an Israeli occupation, but from the kleptocrats in Fatah and from the theocrats in Hamas. I think it is tragic that the Palestinian leadership has effectively refused to participate in an effort to at least kickstart the Palestinian economy. It reminds you of Abba Eban's famous line of never missing an opportunity to miss an opportunity. But what's really important here is that we bear in mind what the actual contours of the conflict are, just as we bear in mind the actual conflicts of the contours between, of the conflict between Iran and the West, and Iran and the United States. Israel and the Palestinians are not battling over the results of what happened in 1967. They're not battling over a question of territory. I wish they were. If that were the case, all Israel would need to do is withdraw from the territories it occupied in 1967, and you would resolve the conflict. But we have a case demonstration. We have 2005, disengagement, the removal of every single settlement and settler from Gaza. And what Israel got in return wasn't marginally more security, marginally more peace, marginally greater understanding. What Israel got was 3 wars, nonstop attack. So it's normal that Israelis should not look confidently on the idea of simply withdrawing from the West Bank and expecting anything other than a different outcome from the one they got in Gaza. The real contours of this conflict are not about 67, they're about 1948. They're about the willingness of the Palestinians to accept a Jewish state in any territory. It's not about territory, it's about existence. And if we're going to be serious about driving home a peace between Israel and its Palestinian neighbors, it has to begin with a Palestinian willingness to recognize Israel as a Jewish state permanently in its ancestral homeland. If you can't have that, any sort of peace you will build will be on a foundation of sand. So those are the 2 great challenges. How do you go about not simply rearranging borders or pumping money into the Palestinian economy? How do you go about insisting that the Palestinians simply recognize the right of their neighbor to live in peace? And if we're lucky, understand that Israel is not the bane of their existence. Israel is potentially the key to their prosperity and to their progress and to thriving as a nation. Those 2 are the great issues, Iran and the Palestinians. Now, I talked earlier about what Israel was able to do and what we seem to be failing in the West to do. And I think Israel was able to do something that is important and that we're losing sight of here. How do you marry your deepest ethical traditions with critical, logical faculties? How do you bring together rationality with tradition and history? In a sense, that is the essence of what you do as lawyers. You bring together ethics with reason, and that produces law and, at its best, justice. Israel's an imperfect country that makes plenty of mistakes, but it produces lawyers and attorneys and activists and thought leaders who are constantly struggling to find a way to create that marriage between ethics and reason in order to produce justice. That's what the achievement of the Hebrew University has been for the past century. That's what we could do a little more of here in the United States, particularly in recent years. So what I think you're doing today is not only a great aid to the Hebrew University and a great tribute to who you are as lawyers, but a model, an example of how we ought to behave, not just as Jews, but as Americans. Thank you very much.